Hello and welcome back to Rev Endurance Sports and another edition of Bike Profiles. So, from time to time, something comes through the store that is just a little bit different or rekindles a memory of mine. And this is such a bike. I get tons of Treks and Specialized and Cannondales come through here, and the run-of-the-mill bike, and it needs service and it's out the door. But I thought I would talk about this bike because this bike and this company are very, very important to where the cycling technology and development ended up and where we are today. So the company I'm talking about is Cervelo, and this particular bike is called the S1. So let's talk about it so I can tell you if you're new to cycling or if you've heard some tall tales in the past. Let's talk about this bike. As I mentioned, this is a Cervelo S1, and this bike was the customer believes it's from 2010. So that kind of makes sense. Initially, and let's talk about Cervelo. So Cervelo, two guys, Phil White and Gerard Verrumen, two guys going to college, engineering eggheads, and that's kind of the play on words for the name. Cervelo in Italian would be brain, but velo, V-E-L-O, is bike in French. So brain bike, right? So very engineer heavy type of company. So what they did is they were going through, hey, let's make an aerodynamic bike that does not follow normal conventional thinking. So they made the Baraki. Then in the 96 Olympics, they had a bike for that. But, it didn't have the double triangle situation, so of course that got scrapped. Then they continued with the aerodynamic research and created a time trial bike, the P2, and then eventually the Soloist Team. Now the Soloist Team goes back to 2002. So now that's 20 years ago. Today's 2022, August. So they created the Soloist Team, and it was an aluminum bike, and they had these arrow-shaped down tube and fork and stuff like that. Now you gotta think back. There was still a lot of round tube frames. I should say predominantly round tube frames. Carbon was coming around, becoming more and more prevalent. Steel was going away, titanium was going away, and so aluminum. They they had the Soloist Team underneath pro riders on Team CSC. So aluminum bike racing in the pro peloton. And if you read some of their advertising material from the day, they'll continue to say, yes, this aluminum frame rides better than carbon frames, or it's a carbon frame substitute. And it's probably true, because carbon frames in the early 2000s were not that great, right? We know that. Okay, so this bike, Soloist Team, then came the Soloist. Now in 2006, all the hubbub was, oh my God, they're going to make this bike in carbon. And that was the Soloist carbon frame. And I was one of the first adopters to have that bike. And in 2007, I did race across America on a Soloist carbon bike, road bike, and then I had a P3 triathlon time trial bike. And so I would switch on and off as I did 3,000 miles across the country. Now, that was a big deal for them to make a carbon bike with arrow-shaped tubing in 2006. Now you see it everywhere. It's not that big of a deal, but Cervelo and the Soloist, which is what this bike is, started all of that. And so a little piece of history came through my store. I've just done an overhaul on this. All new cables, all new housing. This is a very, very good representation of what the bike would have been like in 2010, because it is just in really, really good shape. The gentleman has had a couple of kids over the last 4 to 5 years, hasn't been riding much, is motivated to get back on the bike, and so we've done a lot of work here. But let's just go over a few things. So this 3T fork, I mean, this is way back then, this was a big deal to have an aerodynamic fork on your bike. The very narrow head tube, which Ritchey talks a lot about, but you know, very narrow head tube with a 1 1/8 steer tube, because a lot of bikes in those days still were running 1 inch, and some had 1 1/8, but they had a very bulbous looking head tube. So they wanted to trim this down, hourglass figure, so that you could still run a 1 1/8, not have a lot of material, and always focused on aerodynamics. Then you've got the knock-up profiles on the down tube, so very big deal. And if you look, even the seat tube was aero. So this bike, like I said, this was one of the very, very, very first bikes in its first iteration in 2002, and then 2004 it changed names. And I had one of these in the black anodized or gray anodized finish, and I loved that bike. It was, you know, there's this concept of, you know, underbiked or overbiked. I always love showing up places with a bike, because I'm a contrarian, with a bike that is underbiked. In other words, bringing a knife to a gunfight. And I loved riding the Cervelo aluminum anodized finish bike when everyone else was riding a carbon frame, and just keeping up with everyone there. So this particular bike, you know, the beautiful stuff still, it still has, at the time, a threaded bottom bracket. It has semi-internal cable routing. In other words, it goes through the down tube, but still comes out at the bottom bracket underneath here. And it is the tiniest of holes, by the way. And it's hard for me to get up underneath there, but maybe I'll put the bike up on the stand another time. But yeah, comes out through this tiny little hole underneath the bike. And then it then continues externally along the chainstay here. So, you know, this is not full internal cable routing, but pretty close to it. The brake cable is running inside the top tube. So there you go. And one of the big things that they promoted at the time is that this was a reversible seat post. So you have this clamp here, and you would take that, loosen that up, and then you would have this head, you could flip it, and so you have 73-degree seat tube geometry or 76 seat tube geometry. And so what I did with this bike, there's my FedEx guy. So what I did with this bike often was, folks would come in, you know, they're all excited. Someone has told them, hey, if you're gonna do triathlons, you need a time trial bike or a triathlon bike. And I'd say, well, you know what? Here's a great bike that you can start with. Let's put some aero bars on your road handlebars. And if you don't like the sport of triathlon, you still have a kick butt road bike to ride. And you don't have this dedicated triathlon bike, and now you no longer like the sport. So reversible head on the seat post. As I mentioned, you had the aerodynamic tubing. So this bike was sold as great bike for breakaway riders, great bike for criteriums, great bike to do multi-sport, which, you know, triathlon, great bike to just do time trials on. So you had the opportunity for a very versatile bike to use. And, you know, eventually carbon technology took over. Oh, and talking about that anodized one, from what I hear, it was just too expensive, too maybe environmentally too hard to do a complete bike anodized. Now, you know, stems and seat posts and you know, the head wheels that I talk about a lot here, they're anodized. But, you know, a complete bike, I guess, just got too environmentally challenging or expensive. And so no longer anodized, and then carbon, of course, took over, and so no longer were you able to get this frame. And, you know, if you find one of these and you're not a weight weenie, aerodynamic wise, that's more important in a lot of cases, rolling resistance and aerodynamics, rather than worrying about the weight of a bike, especially if you live in a flatter area, or you're doing a flatter type of event, even though you live in a hilly or mountainous area. Okay, well, that's all for today. Just wanted to show you a little piece of history. The Cervelo S1, multiple names, multiple paint schemes. Basically, it's the same bike as the Soloist Team, which started, in my opinion, the aerodynamic aero road market. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you up the road.